Since I like going back and listening to my old thoughts, I'm currently in the process of re-uploading some of my older videos in order to make them more compliant with YouTube's policies on reused content. But since I didn't want to do a lot of editing, here is the audio from my original review for this movie.
Reuniting in Vietnam almost 50 years after their service, four brothers in arms search for the remains of their fallen comrade, nicknamed Storm and Norman. Or at least, that is their cover story, as they also search for something that they had intentionally left behind. As usual, Spike Lee uses his movie as a means to say something important about American culture. This time, Da 5 Bloods shines a spotlight on black veterans and the trauma some of them have likely experienced. African Americans have undergone centuries worth of racism and injustice in America. So imagine being shipped off to a war that you didn't start and you didn't choose to fight in against a people who haven't done anything wrong to you or your culture, when you're not even welcome in your own home country of America. And once you return home, you are still unwelcomed and faced with racism and injustice in spite of your patriotic actions. That's a pretty harsh truth to accept, but that's the reality that some veterans had to face. And quite frankly, it's the reality that we still live in. So, if you couldn't already tell, Da 5 Bloods is a film that is filled with some pretty heavy themes, and it was released during a pretty relevant time, as people are currently protesting against police brutality and systematic racism in order to fight for the protection of black lives and black rights. This is a movie that feels like it was only just recently made specifically for this exact moment in history. Only, that's not true. Ever since Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee has been trying to show us the inequality that African Americans face every day. And Da 5 Bloods is no different. Only now, we can all feel the importance of the subject matter because we hear about it so much in our news cycles and on our social media platforms. But the material found in Da 5 Bloods is just as important now as it was during the actual Vietnam War. So the fact that not much has changed from the 1960s to 2020 and that institutionalized racism still exists in America today is a fucking disgrace. But okay, I'm not really here to talk about politics. So with the timeliness of the subject matter aside, how does Da 5 Bloods fare as an actual narrative? Well, that may depend on your own opinion of Spike Lee. Lee's recent movies have been pretty hit or miss for me. I loved BlacKkKlansman, but I couldn't stand Chirac. And I think Da 5 Bloods falls somewhere in the middle of those two films. I think it's an important movie that addresses important and socially relevant issues, but I didn't quite love it. Da 5 Bloods feels less like a movie with characters in a story, and more like an attempt for Spike Lee to spark up a conversation with his viewers. I mean, there are points in the film where characters break the fourth wall and literally talk to the audience about the actual themes, and I found this to be a little sloppy. Instead of allowing the themes to appear naturally and have the audience organically reflect on the issues presented in the movie, Lee chooses to spoon-feed us his thoughts and force us to think about the material by having the characters spout clunky dialogue at us. I get that this is an artistic choice for Spike Lee, but I just don't like being forced to engage in a dialogue when the material is already so obviously on the nose. I mean, Da 5 Bloods has a simple and straightforward premise involving four guys who basically go on a heist in Vietnam. And when their plans go wrong, some gritty and violent action ensues. So I wish I could have just seen that narrative play out naturally, instead of just watching Lee cram every single thought he has ever had on the subject of Vietnam, veterans, and black lives into this film. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad The Five Bloods is a movie that is about more than just itself, but the basic premise of the film is so engaging on its own that I believe the themes would have still been present even without Lee being so unsubtle about it. But I will say that Lee successfully managed to make The Five Bloods an immersive experience. Everything in the film felt purposeful, even with minor technical details like when the movie shifts between aspect ratios. Unlike, say, in a Michael Bay Transformers film, where the aspect ratio changes in the same scene for absolutely no fucking reason. But the shift in aspect ratio into Five Bloods is meant to signify a change in time and location. And Lee directs the hell out of these action sequences. There are plenty of scenes in the film that are intense and gripping. One scene in particular had me on the edge of my seat. It had my complete and undivided attention. And I liked how the actors involved played their characters during these tense moments. They're portraying old men, but their characters are veterans, so as former soldiers, they return to combat almost instinctually, as if picking up a gun and firing at the enemy was a form of muscle memory. I just really enjoyed these sequences. And since I brought them up, I should probably talk about the cast. Delroy Lindo, Isaiah Whitlock Jr., Clark Peters, and Norm Lewis are all great together. I really enjoyed the friendship their characters had with one another, and I believed in their camaraderie. They felt like real people and real friends despite having differing ideologies. Paul Walter Hauser, Jonathan Majors, and John Reno are also in the film, and they're all pretty good even though they have smaller roles in the narrative. But of course, the standout here is Delroy Lindo. I don't know much about Delroy Lindo, but he easily gives the best performance in this movie. In fact, he probably gives the best performance I've seen all year. I may not have agreed with a single word that Delroy's character Paul had said, but damn did I feel intrigued by his perspective. He's a deeply disturbed person who has lost his touch because he was profoundly impacted by his experiences in the war. For everyone else, the war is over, but for Paul, he still lives with it. He's constantly on edge and he distrusts everyone, including his own friends and including his own son. Paul shifts between being the main character, since he probably has the biggest arc, to being the central villain in the story. He's just quite a complex character, and Delroy brings him to life so wonderfully. He has such a presence in this film, and he brings a certain intensity to the role. I don't know if Delroy will be eligible for an Academy Award since The Five Bloods wasn't theatrically released, but damn, he definitely should be. The biggest disappointment in the cast, however, for me at least, would have to be Chadwick Boseman, and that's because he's barely in the movie at all. I thought he was going to play the main character of the entire film, but he might as well not even be in the movie. Boseman plays the fallen comrade that the Bloods are going back for in the first place, which means that his character only exists in flashback. But he's barely in the flashbacks either. I just don't know why Boseman was casted in this film. Storm and Norman only exists in the memory of the Bloods, so as such, he's portrayed to be this holy, saint-like figure who never did anything wrong and always led the Bloods down a righteous path. He was both their Malcolm and their Martin. And every time we see Boseman on screen, the visuals reinforce this idea by featuring an overwhelming amount of messianic imagery. But this depiction of Storm and Norman felt rather cartoonish. He came across as a caricature and less like a real, fleshed out character. I also thought it was interesting that Lee chose not to recast the main characters during the flashback sequences. So when we see Storm and Norman leading the Bloods, we see Chadwick Boseman in charge of a bunch of old guys. Some people may be thrown back by that creative decision, but I didn't mind it much. At first, I thought it was a funny visual, but I eased into it as the movie went on. It was easy to keep track of who was who. but I was reminded of The Irishman. Even though De Niro was de-aged for his flashback scenes, we could very easily tell that an old man was trying to portray a younger character. So I'm glad Lee didn't even attempt to de-age his older cast, because we all got the idea of what he was going for. Spike Lee has never been subtle as a director. He can often come across as heavy-handed, but I admire that he's an artist who always has something to say, something relevant, something uncomfortable, but something that's resonating. Da 5 Bloods is not a perfect movie. It is very on the nose with its themes and its subject matter. Some subplots don't lead anywhere, certain characters pop in and out of the story for no real reason, and the most well-known members of the cast are barely in the film at all. But I'm happy that a movie like this exists. It reminds me of the many various perspectives out in the world that differ from my own. And we are definitely living in a time for inclusion and hearing out the voices that have been silenced for far too long. I just wish Lee was able to tighten up the film a bit, focus up the narrative, and not just spoon-feed us his heavy-handed themes. So, I may not have loved Da 5 Bloods, but it is a movie that definitely sat with me. I couldn't help but think about it long after I had finished watching it, and I'll likely end up watching it again pretty soon since it's just sitting there on Netflix. I was intrigued by its premise. 4 ex-soldiers who are haunted by the ghosts of war return to their old battleground in order to retrieve their fallen leader. It's a movie that reminds us of how war can affect the mind, how riches can break apart friendships, and that institutionalized racism has been going on for far too long in American history. More importantly, it reminds us that Black lives do matter. So for that, I would likely give Da 5 Bloods 3 3/4 out of 5 stars. Thanks for watching.